Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all had a good lunch and a good viewing of the exhibition. You can see more of it tonight. And these events are always wonderful because they're reunions. So it's wonderful to see so many friends, so many scholars that have inspired my work who are here today. So we're going to begin the part two of A Line That Birds Cannot See, Mexican and U.S. Art and Artists Crossing Borders in the 20th Century. And our first speaker for the afternoon is Monica Bravo, who is a lecturer in the History of Art Department and the program in Ethnicity, Race, and Migration at Yale University. She specializes in the history of photography and modern art of the Americas. Her dissertation and current book project examines exchanges between U.S. modernist photographers and modern Mexican artists working in painting, poetry, music, and photography, resulting in the development of a greater American modernism in the interwar period. Her research has been supported by fellowships from the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, the Center for Creative Photography, the Georgia O'Keeffe Research Center, the Harry Ransom Center, the Huntington Library and Collections, and the Terra Foundation for American Art. So I welcome Monica to the stage.
Thank you, Carmen, for that introduction and for organizing this symposium and such a beautiful exhibition upstairs. I also wanted to thank Anne and Nona, who are helping us out behind this stage, and to the other presenters whose talks have been really interesting, and I'm looking forward to hearing the rest this afternoon as well. And thanks to the audience as well. Arte popular emerged as modernism's other in Mexico City of the 1920s, nearly concurrently with the rise of folk art in New York. Exhibitions were a primary means of elevating folk art in the public's imagination in both nations, in addition to exposing a generation of modern artists to popular art's cultural values. Modernist painters, photographers, and sculptors in the 1920s, including some of those I will discuss today, shared with folk art a preference for flattened space, strong color, and schematized, streamlined forms. Yet the modernist investment in popular art went beyond formal qualities to include an affinity for everyday subjects, its so-called primitivism, its popular rather than elite appeal, and its indigeneity to the Americas. In addition to tracing exhibition histories in both Mexico and the U.S. in the first portion of my talk, in the remaining time, my analysis will compare modernist varied responses to folk art. Ultimately, I want to consider how objects made by unknown craftsmen, widely believed to be the purest expression of a nation's people, were transmuted into individualized expression by cosmopolitan artists. In particular, I will examine this process through the examples of Edward Weston, Diego Rivera, and Frida Kahlo, each of whom collected arte popular and found in it the potential for modernist transformation. The 1920s in both the U.S. and Mexico were periods of rapid industrialization and change, triggered respectively by the end of the Great War and the Mexican Revolution. In the U.S., the erection of urban skyscrapers and undertaking of massive infrastructure projects across the rural landscape, no less than the popularization of modern plumbing, meant that it could justifiably claim to have entered the machine age, and many artists rendered these effects visible. In Mexico, meanwhile, electric lighting in Chapultepec Park, scaffolding on buildings, and the spread of the radio signaled modernization. Vanguard groups like the Estridentistas and Contemporáneos often pictured its effects on Mexican workers with some measure of ambivalence. Along with the sometimes tentative, often enthusiastic embrace of modernization, the very same artists and cultural thinkers who strove to develop an aesthetic appropriate to the age were some of the first to revisionistically recover folk ancestors, and in many cases their untutored contemporaries, on which to rest a native, that is, non-European, aesthetic. Rewriting history to include folk art, Wanda Korn argues, helped validate machine-age modernist aesthetics in the U.S., grounding the new in a long nationalist tradition. However, this process unfolded in remarkably parallel ways on both sides of the border, as Ana Indych-López has argued, often with Mexico leading the way. A series of high-profile exhibitions organized by the likes of Dr. Adel in Mexico City, Catherine Ann Porter and Javier Guerrero in Los Angeles, and Henry Schnackenberg and Juliana Force in New York highlighted the aesthetic and not merely the ethnographic merits of popular art, often with a secondary goal of utility, the idea that promoting these modes would help modern artists in their own aesthetic creations. Dr. Adel, the adopted name of painter Gerardo Murillo, showcased handmade crafts from across the nation in the Exposición de Arte Popular and a related two-volume catalog, Las Artes Populares en México, both of 1921. As many of my colleagues have noted, including Ana, Rick Lopez, Jay Oles, and most recently Harper Montgomery, the installation, which is organized according to object type, resembles that of a popular market or puesto, or even of a curio shop targeted to tourists. In addition to valorizing these distinct objects, pottery, textiles, toys, vernacular paintings, etc., for their freedom from foreign influence, Adel helped spur a market for folk art among middle and upper-class Mexicans, as well as foreigners, that has not yet abated. For Adel, popular art represented the Mexican people's most authentic form of expression. What is more, as Lopez writes, for Adel, quote, Mexico's handicrafts were expressions of an entire collective history, of a race, and of a nation, end quote. As such, Mexican folk art became a powerful means of cultural diplomacy. Writer Catherine Ann Porter, who traveled extensively between the U.S. and Mexico in the 1920s, adopted Adel's exhibition for a Los Angeles presentation and catalog in November 1922. As you can see on the right, the exhibition was supported by the Mexican government, curated from Roberto Turnbull's collection, and envisioned by the Mexican artist Javier Guerrero as a sequel to Adel's Mexico City show. Despite various complications with U.S. customs agents, the exhibition was well attended, attracting 3,000 to 4,000 visitors a day. Admiration for Mexican arte popular on both sides of the border coincided precisely with an eruption of interest in the United States' own folk art traditions. Before the 1920s, collecting folk art was largely the purview of antiquarians in New England and Pennsylvania, eventually catching on with Ogunquit modernists in Maine. Painter Henry Schnackenberg's 1924 Early American Art exhibit at the Whitney Studio Club was the first public exhibition of folk art in the U.S., held just 3 years after Adel's Exposición de Arte Popular in Mexico. Adel's exhibition was larger in scale and government-supported, with many exhibited objects simply purchased on trips to the interior, whereas Schnackenberg drew on the collections of club director Juliana Force and of modernist painters like Charles Demuth, Yasuo Kuniyoshi, and Charles Sheeler. While Adel's show was primarily composed of three-dimensional objects, early American art included a preponderance of oil paintings, as you can see in this two-page spread. Later, curator Holger Cahill and dealer Edith Halpert contributed mightily to renewed non-antiquarian interest in folk art, a field they helped to define. For Cahill, famously, folk art was, quote, the expression of the common people, made by them and intended for their use and enjoyment, end quote. Notably, he did not publicly muse on what it might mean for that intention to be broken, for the enjoyment of folk art to pass over into a more rarefied realm, with all the attendant implications of the genre's commodification. Even if Cahill had to acknowledge the British roots of some of the objects in his exhibitions, and Mexican scholars increasingly recognized the Spanish line of influence in arte popular in addition to the indigenous, cultural leaders in both nations could justifiably claim to have discovered what Van Wyck Brooks called a usable past, which in many cases was actually a parallel usable present on which to rest the native modernism. What is consistent across these two models, however, that of U.S. folk art and Mexican arte popular, is the belief that these simple, handmade objects are most expressive of national identity. Before moving on to examine instances of individual modernists drawing inspiration from decorative arts and crafts, I want to gesture at how cultural leaders, now at the level of the state, began to indicate how a collective heritage could be individualized in the 1920s and 30s, perhaps naively against the backdrop of fascism's spread in Europe. Vestmagard's drawing method codified 7 principal Mexican motifs that were developed into a nationwide curriculum in 1921. His symbols were drawn primarily from pre-Columbian artifacts and could be combined in infinite variations. And this has been the subject of some of Karen Cordero-Ryman's research as well. Vestmagard believed that post-revolutionary generations would develop a national style based on his standardized approach. Over 10 years later, in the United States, Cahill and the Works Progress Administration had as its primary goal for the Index of American Design, which ran from 1935 to 1942, to record materials allegedly in danger of being lost, to be a resource to modern artists and educational institutions, and to employ out-of-work commercial artists. This project, like Vestmagard's, sought to instrumentalize folk art. Although Cahill famously stated that folk art belonged to people without academic training, in Vestmagard's drawing method and Cahill's own Index of American Design, we begin to see how the design principles of popular art were teachable and could be instituted top-down. However, while they may have succeeded in folding the aesthetics of folk art and arte popular into discourses of cultural nationalism, its political and social contexts were transformed. Photographer Edward Weston was among the many thousands who visited Porter and Guerrero's exhibition of Mexican popular arts and crafts in Los Angeles in late 1922, early 1923. Just a few months later, Weston arrived in Mexico City with his student and lover, Tina Modotti, and his eldest son. He would stay for 3 years. Weston's choice of Mexico was not particularly unique. Like many others, he was drawn to the bohemian lifestyle and cosmopolitan environment fostered by the profusion of artists and intellectuals who gathered in the post-revolutionary nation. Although he soon set up a commercial portrait studio like the one he had given up in suburban Los Angeles, in his artistic practice, he sought a complete break with his established mode of working. Weston had already earned international acclaim for his work in the soft-focus allegorical style known as pictorialism that had long been in vogue. In 1922, Weston produced his first works in the straight photographic style, what we might now think of as modernist photography. He was encouraged on this new path by New York-based photographers Alfred Stieglitz and Charles Sheeler, the latter of whom was involved with the Whitney Studio Club as an avid collector of Shaker furniture, which he valued for the purity of its forms and simplified geometries, qualities evident in his own modernist photographs and paintings. Interestingly then, before even arriving in Mexico, Weston had been drawn independently to Mexican arte popular in Los Angeles and to Sheeler's photographs in New York. In this light, Weston's attraction is not particularly surprising. Both art forms encouraged him to gravitate towards flattened forms and to privilege graphic compositional elements. He took this modernist approach to photography with him to Mexico, determined to eschew picturesque subject matter. Weston's social circle in Mexico included many Mexican painters such as Arol, Diego Rivera, and Jean Charlot. In addition to several solo shows, Weston frequently exhibited with his friends among the muralists. And on the right, you can see Eduardo Weston's name, as well as the fact that this exhibition included some examples of ceramic folk art. In Mexico, Weston gravitated to new subject matter, including to subjects treated by his friends. Weston soon recognized the nationalist underpinnings for his contemporaries' folk, archaeological, and natural subject matter, all celebrating Mexican identity. Among Weston's most important Mexican works are the photographs of toys or juguetes and ceramics. Weston's photographs complemented Mexico's sense of itself as a nation where history is made present and whose culture emerges organically from its spirituality and landscape. In his photographs of juguetes and ceramics, we see Weston paying homage to Mexican arte popular and its makers, but we also see him transforming this content in his own art with his technologically progressive medium and cool modernist approach. By 1924, Weston had amassed quite a collection of handmade toys. He wrote, quote, "I never tire of the juguetes. They are invariably spontaneous and genuine, done without striving, fancied and fun. One imagines the Indians laughing and joking as they model and paint," end quote. For Weston, there is a strong correlation between the craftsman and his creations. Far from passively collecting them, Weston likewise delighted in parading the toys before his camera in various arrangements, resulting in fresh compositions. Weston, like his Mexican contemporaries, particularly Adel, had more reverence for pottery. Not only was pottery literally the stuff of the Mexican soil, it was the earth-made object by the hands of Mexican craftsmen. Weston's photographic frontispiece to Anita Brenner's 1929 Idols Behind Altars depicts one such hand, claw-like, gripping a ceramic vessel against a blank sky. The image seems to defy several photographic rules. Shot slightly from below, only the gourd-like object and not the hand benefits from the sun's rays. Context is minimized so that the subject is silhouetted against the sky. Save for the texture of the vessel, detail is eliminated. Hand and plant are united in tonality so that the hand becomes the stem of a strange plant. Balanced rather than symmetrical, the subject is surrounded by the precise amount of negative space to convey triumphant force rather than preciousness. The fine craftsmanship of the photograph both reflects quality of and confers quality on the ceramic pot. The caption states, "Hand of the potter Amado Galvan, photographed by Edward Weston," thereby uniting the achievements of two named artists, one Mexican and one from the United States. The note on the illustration in the book's appendix, written by Brenner, reads, "Amado Galvan, whose hand appears in the frontispiece, is one of the most gifted of contemporary Mexican craftsmen. Pottery decoration is a tradition in his family, which dates to untraceable beginnings, as is the case in the families of most of his neighbors in the potter's village of Tonalá, in the state of Jalisco." The two temporalities in these sentences link the contemporary with untraceable beginnings. Along with the temporal shift, the caption telescopes out from an individual to his family to his community, now tied to a specific location. This logic accords with another element of post-revolutionary thought, that the patrias chicas, or small homelands, have united to form a collective nation. But overcoming regionalism was only one aspect of an ultimately national or even transnational objective. The union of Mexican and U.S. artistry, the desire to imbue the contemporary with ancient traditions, and the inseparable connection of individuals to broader societies, all of these themes are conveyed through the frontispiece and its brief accompanying text. In his understanding of Mexican cultural discourses, Weston was guided by his friends among the muralists and cosmopolitan writers like Brenner, as well as by the Arte Popular itself, which he joyfully collected for his home. Only with his trips outside of Mexico City to fulfill Brenner's commission in 1926, however, did he begin to come in contact with El Pueblo. He claimed at last to have felt the soil. Although he had great admiration for Mexican craftsmen and their wares, evident here in the careful rendering of their facture and compositional frontality, we recognize not the potter, but Weston as the modernist author of Tres Ollas de Oaxaca, a photograph much admired by his friend Diego Rivera. Contrary to monolithic conceptions of Los Tres Grandes, the muralists remained divided among themselves on the role that popular art should take in modern Mexico. The Vidal Faro Siqueiros, for instance, was notoriously dismissive of Mexican curios, while Rivera had real and perhaps strategic admiration for the popular. Although he sometimes rendered arte popular in his large-scale murals and more commonly in his smaller easel paintings and prints, what we more commonly see in Rivera's example is his positioning of himself as the modernist inheritor of folk traditions. For example, Mexican Paintings Pulquerias was the third article in a series Rivera wrote for Francis Tour's bilingual cultural journal, Mexican Folkways, for which Rivera was then serving as art director. Though little known today, pulquerias once formed an integral part of the Mexican cityscape. Pulquerias were working-class bars so named because they served pulque, a viscous white alcohol fermented from the juice of Mexico's maguey cactus. Rivera begins his article of 1926, which was illustrated with Weston's photographs, by announcing, quote, "One of the most important manifestations of Mexican painting, I have said this before many times, is the decoration of the fronts and interiors of pulquerias and eating houses," end quote. On first impression, paying tribute to pulquerias is an odd choice of subject for an artist best known for his commitments to communist politics and modernist painting. Yet true to his nature, Rivera praises the paintings created by anonymous craftsmen precisely for their anti-bourgeois qualities, their mass appeal, and their manifestation of the Mexican interest in color. These were, of course, the same characteristics Rivera sought to cultivate with the murals he painted on civic buildings in the early 1920s. For example, Rivera's immense mural cycle for the Mexican Secretary of Public Education, or SEP, undertaken from 1923 to 1926, show common types as well as identifiable individuals arranged in vignettes depicting events historical, mythic, and mundane, much like the pulqueria paintings themselves. Their formal kinship is readily apparent in the integration of painting and architecture, the streamlining of forms, and the use of vibrant color. In paying homage to the pulqueria paintings and their makers, Rivera implicitly presents Mexican muralism as the predestined modernist heir to this legacy. Their intentions were quite dissimilar, however. Rivera regarded the paintings on the facades and interiors of pulquerias as expressive of the national character. But with his murals, he knowingly contributed to a post-revolutionary project of national identity construction. The former was a bottom-up, organic achievement, the latter top-down and frequently ideological. Further, although the muralism movement had begun as a collective, organized in solidarity with the proletariat and as a rejection of bourgeois values, certainly Rivera's authorship of his murals, like his authorship of articles for Mexican folkways, was inseparable from his artwork in a way that it was not for the anonymous pulqueria painters he praised. In keeping with the enormous vogue for things Mexican, both Rivera and Frida Kahlo were avid collectors of arte popular, surrounding themselves with whimsical ceramics, trays, furniture, figurines, and Judas figures, papier-mâché effigies traditionally burned at Easter time, even before they moved into the famous San Angel Casa Estudio in 1934. Of course, Kahlo rendered objects from her collection of arte popular in her still lifes, like Weston, and even pictured similar U.S. folk art objects during her stay in Detroit. Like Rivera, she also positioned some of her modernist paintings in the lineage of Mexican popular painting tradition, including ex-voto paintings made to fulfill vows, which are often painted on metal and usually have a narrative element, and which she avidly collected and famously adapted here. However, I want to focus on a mode of arte popular that Kahlo appropriated along with other middle and upper class women in Mexico, Tehuana-style dress. The Tehuanas were a matriarchal society relatively untouched by U.S. or Spanish influence, thereby considered to represent a bygone Mexico free of colonial influence and closer to indigeneity. And on the left, you can see a portrait Weston made of Kahlo upon meeting her in San Francisco when she was traveling there with Rivera. For this reason, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec excited great interest among Mexican modernists and other cosmopolitan artists in the 1920s and 30s. José Vasconcelos, the director of the SEP, famously sent Rivera there for a re-education in authentic Mexican culture after his creation mural for the National Preparatory School proved insufficiently Mexican. He would return many times thereafter. Modotti likewise made a pilgrimage there in 1929 to photograph the matriarchal Tehuanas, and Rufino Tamayo, for all his anti-nationalist rhetoric, depicted them in this oil painting, which is on view upstairs and is truly incredible in person. Indeed, the list of artists who sought inspiration in the Tehuanas is too numerous to mention here. In her famous double portrait, Kahlo presents a bifurcated identity. On the left, she wears a 19th century style wedding dress. On the right, she wears the huipil, traditionally woven on a backstrap loom, and skirt that associated her with Tehuanas and thus the indigenous. The painting is a reaction to her divorce from Rivera, but also alludes to double portraits of Cortés and La Malinche, the forebearers of all modern mestizo Mexicans. Kahlo, like Georgia O'Keeffe and Gertrude Stein, stands in a long line of women who use dress not only in their portraits, but also in their daily self-presentation to project carefully curated aspects of their identity. Adriana Zavala examines the intersectionality of gender and race in the creation of Mexican identity in the post-revolutionary era, finding that, quote, indigenous women came to symbolize national authenticity, end quote, and that modernists like Kahlo knowingly appropriated indigenous costume in order to Mexicanize her art and heritage, in keeping with this particular discourse of Mexicanidad. For Kahlo, who collected handmade skirts and textiles, adopting Tehuana dress was a way of signaling the authenticity of her own Mexican painting. Through the examples of Weston, Rivera, and Kahlo, I wanted to demonstrate three different models of how modernists responded to, and in some cases appropriated, U.S. folk art, and particularly different kinds of Mexican arte popular. These were objects that became tremendously popular among both the general audience and modern artists, in no small part through several significant exhibitions organized by Aro, Porter and Guerrero, Cahill, and Alpert. All of these individuals projected certain characteristics onto arte popular that would legitimize modernist tastes. In the examples I have presented, objects handmade typically by unknown craftsmen and theorized by their elite contemporaries as being most expressive of national identity are made over by modern artists into individualized expression. Weston through his technical treatment of Mexican juguetes and ceramics, Rivera's in his praise for the pulqueria paintings that, in his conception, paved the way for his murals, and Kahlo's in her physical identification with the Tehuanas, which lent her own paintings, rendered in a consciously naive style, a degree of authentic Mexicanidad. I began this paper by discussing modernist othering of folk art in the U.S. and of arte popular in Mexico. However, I hope to have shown that for all these aesthetic modes are inextricably intertwined. What is popular about modernism, at least in these examples, is just about everything. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Breanne Robertson. Breanne's research focuses on issues of race, national identity, and cross-cultural exchange between the United States and Mexico in 19th and early 20th century American art. Her dissertation, Forging a New World Nationalism, Ancient Mexico in United States Art and Visual Culture from 1933 to 1945, elucidates U.S. artists' appropriation of pre-Columbian themes in relation to the Latin American foreign policy initiatives of the Roosevelt administration. Robertson previously taught American art history at Wesleyan University and has held fellowships at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, Dumbarton Oaks Library and Museum, and our own Smithsonian American Art Museum. Essays drawn from her research have appeared in American Art, The Annals of Iowa, and Hemisphere, Visual Cultures of the Americas. Her current book projects include a monograph on Pan-Americanism and art under the Good Neighbor policy, as well as an edited volume examining the history and cultural meaning of the Iwo Jima flag raising. Please welcome Dr. Robertson.
Thank you for that introduction, Amelia, and thank you to Carmen for organizing this wonderful event. I've learned so much already from my colleagues, and I'm really delighted to be part of the conversation. I even wore birds on my dress in honor of this event. In the years leading up to and including the Second World War, the United States government worked to build a strategic alliance with Latin American nations to prevent Nazism from entering the New World. Weaker than the United States both militarily and economically, Latin American nations ostensibly offered Germany, Italy, and Japan easy entry to the hemisphere and a staging ground for attacks against the United States. Pan-American solidarity formed a significant component of the U.S. government's plan for national defense. In his inaugural address of March 4, 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt introduced the Good Neighbor policy, hoping to rehabilitate imperialist images of the United States and to secure Latin American cooperation against European fascism. As part of these efforts, the Roosevelt administration recast American identity in a hemispheric context. Calling upon traits that could be considered both American and Latin American, U.S. foreign policy initiatives sought to establish cultural ties that would foster goodwill across the Americas. Art and visual culture was an essential ingredient in this diplomatic myth-making process. Kenneth Adams, Lowell Houser, and Charles White, to name a few, responded to the U.S. government's call for Pan-Americanism by creating works that went beyond simple bonds of friendship to suggest a shared cultural lineage as well. No longer divided into North-South or Anglo-Latin dichotomies, the United States and Latin America appeared as a singular territorial body whose origins and ideologies established a uniquely American heritage distinct from European culture. Latin American modernists likewise took part in this decade-long project during their North American travels. While living and working in the United States, Mexican artists such as Jesus Guerrero Galvan and Diego Rivera responded to the utopian rhetoric of transnational cooperation by putting forward their conceptions of Pan-Americanism for domestic U.S. consumption. The resulting constellation of murals forms a unified tissue of artistic material that deepens and complicates our understanding of U.S.-Mexican cultural exchange and soft power diplomacy under the Good Neighbor policy. To be sure, the specifics of history demonstrate that American and Mexican artists both set out to invent a visual rhetoric suited for this task. And while the motivations and philosophical charge of Pan-Americanism differed for artists North and South, the resulting exchange of ideas disrupts the simpler notion that the United States developed and exported one set of ideas to Latin America, which in turn resisted U.S. overtures as cultural imperialism. My talk today explores various depictions of hemispheric unity to foreground competing notions of Pan-Americanism and restore the dialogue and debate surrounding the Good Neighbor policy. Iowa artist Lowell Houser was an early and avid supporter of Pan-Americanism. In the 1920s, he embarked on a series of extended trips to Mexico, where he viewed the well-publicized mural efforts of Diego Rivera, Jean Charlot, and others. He also worked 2 seasons as a field artist at Chichen Itza. He gained through this experience an appreciation for Maya culture as a noble example of American antiquity. When I came to Mexico, I thought Maya art was primitive, he wrote in a letter to fellow artist Everett G. Jackson, but now I think it is the most civilized that I know. This assessment prefigured the specialized meaning Mesoamerican history and culture would assume for U.S. citizens under the Good Neighbor policy. Between 1933 and 1945, artists, teachers, and scientists actively promoted indigenous artifacts as evidence of a great hemispheric heritage that also belonged to American citizens. The artistic accomplishments of the Maya especially entered the U.S. historical narrative as ancient forerunners of modern culture. For example, when Civil Works Service constructed models of Maya temples for the Brooklyn Museum in 1934, Curator Herbert Spenden heralded the Mexicans as good Americans because they possessed, quote, skyscraper instinct. He called attention to the visual affinities between Maya stepped pyramids and modern Art Deco architectural design as evidence of a continuous and distinctly American aesthetic linking Anglo and Latin American populations throughout the hemisphere. Houser's mural design for the Ames, Iowa Post Office invokes this discourse to promote U.S. claims of Pan-Americanism. Measuring roughly 18 feet by 6 feet, the evolution of corn presents an epic historical narrative of corn cultivation from its first practitioners in Mesoamerica to the modern United States. The left section of the mural shows a tawny, muscular Mayan with an obsidian-tipped staff planting seeds of corn. Lush green corn stalks attest to his agricultural skill, while a stone maize god effigy alludes to the elaborate belief system at the center of Maya ritual and life. In the right half of the composition, a modern Iowan farmer in denim overalls, work gloves, boots, and a denim cap manually harvests ripe ears of golden corn. Cascading strips of ticker tape and a microscope stress the importance of science and commerce to farming in the present day. The central panel depicts a monumental ear of corn, a transparent kernel sprouting roots, and a superimposed corn stalk. These overlapping elements encapsulate the full growth cycle of corn, from seed embryo to ripened ear, against a vibrant red background. As an instrument of hemispheric identity formation, Houser's painting compositionally and thematically constructs a visual argument, claiming a seamless historical lineage in which the modern Iowan farmer has descended, culturally at least, from the ancient Mayan. To convey this point, Houser employs a one-to-one correlation that underscores the similarities of the two figures. Facing one another in identical bent postures, the Mayan and the Iowan exhibit shared agricultural interests and equal standing. Houser even modeled the farmer and the Mayan Indian on the same individual, Frank J. Lynn, a student at Iowa State College. The Ames Post Office mural typifies much of the art and visual culture devoted to Pan-Americanism by sanitizing less palatable aspects of indigenous culture, such as human sacrifice, and eliding U.S. enacted atrocities against Native peoples in their constructions of transnational identity. By showing a visual continuum between past and present, Houser and others propose a revisionary history that privileges shared hemispheric values and traditions over the divisive realities of slavery, territorial expansion, and Native American genocide. Certainly, one of the primary advantages of turning to pre-Columbian history in this diplomatic context was its geographical and temporal distance from the modern United States. Conceptions of race posed a particularly thorny challenge for artists trying to invent a visual rhetoric in support of transnational identity. Discrimination remained a daily reality for Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the United States, especially in the Southwest. The discrepancy between U.S. narratives of Pan-Americanism and the reality of domestic race relations threatened to damage U.S. diplomatic relations with Latin American governments. Furthermore, the Roosevelt administration worried that Nazi messages of anti-Americanism would appeal to disenfranchised racial minorities, thereby creating ideological inroads for enemy subterfuge. Kenneth Adams' four-panel mural for the University of New Mexico attempts to alleviate these anxieties by presenting an idealized vision of multi-ethnic harmony and peace. The primary diplomatic aim in this instance was to bolster a sense of patriotism among the Spanish-speaking populations of the American Southwest. Completed in 1939, Adams' design followed the thematic guidelines set forth by University President James Fulton Zimmerman, who instructed him to paint the unique cultural contributions of Native Americans, Latinos, and Anglo-Americans to life in the Southwest. This emphasis on cultural contributions is telling, since it framed the subject matter for Adams within the progressive framework of the cultural gifts movement, an anti-prejudice campaign that promoted tolerance by calling attention to the contributions of immigrant and minority groups to American life. Moreover, the separate but equal rhetorical approach permitted Adams to take existing regional narratives of tricultural harmony and redeploy them in the service of hemispheric identity formation. In the first panel, Adams depicts Apache, Navajo, and Pueblo people weaving blankets and molding pottery. Whereas these Native Americans are the so-called artists of the Southwest, Latinos are shown excelling at manual labors such as farming and construction. Two women apply a plaster veneer to a colonial mission-style building, and a man pushes a plow, preparing the soil in the fields. Notably, the agricultural achievements his cultivation provides include distinctly American products, a sheaf of wheat, an apple, and a golden ear of corn. The principal cultural contribution of Anglo-Americans to Southwestern life comes in the form of science. At the center, a doctor holds up a newborn baby as a symbol of health and future promise, while two researchers peer into scientific instruments in a continuing quest for knowledge. Although the essentialized portrayal of culture in these panels adheres to prevailing theories of racialism, which linked inherited racial traits to societal advancement, the final panel announces the advent of a new era of racial equality. Three men, each symbolizing his race, stands on the same plane and hold hands in a fraternal clasp of multi-ethnic unity and cooperation. Adams places the men, now assimilated to Anglo standards of modernity, in the midst of an idealized landscape of Pan-American promise. Proclaiming all three ethnic groups to be legitimate examples of Americanness, Adams' mural appeals to Spanish American, Native American, and Anglo-American citizens, asking all of them to set aside their prejudices and form a united front against European fascism. Meanwhile, Mexico's post-revolutionary government participated in Indigenismo, a cultural movement that celebrated Native Mexican peoples and history as part of its nation-building efforts. Federally sponsored public art projects heralded pre-Columbian civilizations, and especially the Aztec Empire, as the true beginning of Mexican history and as a vital component of mestizaje, a biological philosophy that touted racial mixing as a means to social and cultural reunification. In 1940, Mexican muralist Diego Rivera applied these nationalist ideals to an epic mural participating in the unifying U.S. discourse of hemispheric defense. Titled "The Marriage of the Artistic Expression of North and South of This Continent," Rivera's mural features an array of Mexican and American artists and inventors surrounding a monumental emblem of Pan-American unity. Based on a pre-Hispanic Aztec statue of Coatlicue, the binational allegory fuses indigenous Mexico and corporate America. The left side of the figure replicates the monstrous face, serpent skirt, and stony appearance of the pre-Columbian sculpture, while the right half of the body resembles machinery Rivera had painted previously in his depiction of Henry Ford's Detroit Motor Company. According to the artist, the figure represents a harmonious fusing of the best arts of Mexico and the United States. Quote, "From the south comes the plumed serpent, from the north, the conveyor belt." Notably, the plethora of artists clustered around this cultural hybrid highlight Rivera's opinion that this unified Greater America remains still under construction. Moreover, as Anthony Lee has perceptively argued, the word marriage in the title of this work, coupled with the central depiction of the Mexican artist and the American actress Paulette Goddard holding hands, alludes to Rivera's distinctly Mexican perspective that racial mixing formed a key part of this cultural process. Rivera's mural serves as a stark reminder, then, that the project of Pan-Americanism may have been transnational in focus, but that its goals and pictorial expressions remained moored in a dialogue of competing national perspectives. The Aztec goddess Coatlicue, for example, had become a well-known fixture in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City and an icon of post-revolutionary Mexican identity. In her best-known image, which Rivera quotes here, the goddess wears a necklace of human hands and hearts over a skull breastplate. Writhing snakes form the basis of her skirt, while claws appear in the place of her hands and feet. Because the goddess is decapitated in Aztec lore, two serpents symbolizing blood emerge from her severed neck to form her monstrous visage. American viewers would have been familiar with the monument portrayed in Rivera's mural and its strong association with Mexican nationalism, since the Mexican government sent a plaster cast to the Museum of Modern Art's ambitious exhibition, 20 Centuries of Mexican Art, in 1940. The show attracted thousands of museum visitors and ample news coverage. The popular fashion magazine Vogue featured a cartoon juxtaposing the grotesque Aztec deity against a star-studded crowd of American politicians, writers, and artists. While the notion of Pan-American heritage circulated primarily in the context of inter-American foreign relations, and so referred principally to United States and Latin American citizens of European and Native American descent, the symbolic rather than hereditary nature of cultural lineage, as promoted under the Good Neighbor policy, invited non-white peoples to lay claim to pre-Columbian and Latin American materials as well. Executed at the height of World War II, the contribution of the Negro to democracy in America is best understood as a response to a conservative social climate that demanded overt patriotism and unquestioning support for U.S. military action. Black Americans felt conflicted about participating in a war that the U.S. government justified as a fight for freedom and democracy, while they still lacked equal treatment and full rights of citizenship at home. Through popular publications like Time and Life, White would have seen Rivera's Pan-American Unity Project and read descriptions of its serpent-fanged machine god. He found there a model not only for how to visualize a complex political history, but also for how to imagine a multi-ethnic America. The hybrid figuration and inclusive wartime message of Rivera's Pan-American Unity paralleled White's own aims. Specifically, Rivera rejected the Anglo-U.S. claim to continental leadership by figuring hemispheric solidarity as a composite being. Infusing a racialized Mexican emblem to modern U.S. industry, he invoked the affirmative discourse of indigenismo, which reversed the racial hierarchy in its celebration of Native peoples in history. His formulation not only provided a foreign perspective to the question of U.S. race relations, but also called for immediate racial and cultural integration for the sake of hemispheric defense. Like Rivera's allegorical hybrid, White's colossal figure towers over the other individuals depicted in the composition. It dominates the central axis of the mural, yet all that is visible of the character is its face and hands. The being embraces modern industrial machinery, whose close resemblance to the stamping press and Pan-American Unity suggests that White modeled the machine from reproductions like those featured in Life. In contrast to Rivera's hybrid deity, though, the exposed hands and face of White's Colossus appear undeniably human. The giant blocky hands are curled tightly into fists. The bulging joints of the knuckles exaggerate the underlying skeleton. Its right hand, extended forward and palm down, has wrapped around its middle finger the chains of slavery. Dangling from its left hand is another link of chains. However, the open manacle and the awkward kinks in this string reveal that it is inoperative and will no longer hinder African American progress. The most cryptic aspect of the monumental figure is its face, which the artist depicted slightly upturned and hidden, both by the massive machinery and the picture's upper edge, so that only the mouth is fully visible. The deliberate ambiguity of White's allegory, its relationship to the other figures, its disfigurement through cropping, and its unreadable expression, suggests the difficulties in organizing a united multiracial home front amidst Japanese internment, Mexican repatriation, U.S. military segregation, and nationwide labor discrimination and race riots. Searching for a new way to represent America that would be more inclusive, but also not whitewash U.S. history or current injustices, White drew inspiration from the multiracial rhetoric and visual strategies of Rivera's Pan-Americanism. He thus refutes the sanitized imagery of wartime consensus by put forward by his white colleagues, and he inserts instead that the global struggle against fascism must be fought not only in the Pacific Theater and in Nazi Germany, but also on the United States home front. While White's fresco adapts Rivera's conception of hemispheric identity to address the particularities of Black experience in the United States, Mexican painter Jesus Guerrero Gaván openly rejects the mural precedent set forth by his compatriot at the Golden Gate Exposition. In 1942, the artist accepted an offer to teach and paint at the University of New Mexico as an artist in residence. During his tenure in Albuquerque, Guerrero Gaván completed a fresco on the theme of hemispheric unity at Scholes Hall, the administrative center on campus. Located on the first floor near the offices of the president, bursar, registrar, and deans, the mural occupied a busy corridor trafficked by students and professors on their way to the campus post office and upper floor classrooms. The only building with equivalent stature was the main library, where Kenneth Adams had recently painted his rendition of Pan-Americanism as a recapitulation of New Mexico's longstanding myth of tricultural harmony. Guerrero Gaván conceived of his mural working within and against this decorative program. Union of the Americas joined in liberty must be understood as a pictorial response to Adams' mural cycle. An ardent follower of David Alfaro Siqueiros, Guerrero Gaván also approached the project as a rebuke to Rivera's Pan-American Unity mural in San Francisco. Articulating his aesthetic philosophy in a 1942 article, he denounced his fellow muralists' art as mere tourism for what he perceived to be a willingness to suppress leftist political ideas to please capitalist patrons in the United States. He further criticized Rivera's compositions for being beholden to both nationalism and modernity. Striving in his own art to achieve universality and timelessness, Guerrero Gaván coupled the monumental figuration of archaic Spanish art with the supposed refined barbarity of pre-Hispanic sculpture to form a hybridity of style that was at once avant-garde and a continuation of the past. It comes as no surprise, then, that Guerrero Gaván puts forward an alternative solution to the challenge of Pan-Americanism. His mural depicts an allegorical figure of liberty, recognizable with her signature torch of justice, soaring above a river denoting the geographical border separating the United States and Mexico, with a mother and child seated on either side. Located on the east wall of Scholes Hall, each figural group corresponds to its north-south geographical designation. One pair represents Latin American countries, the other North American nations. Explaining the symbolism of his design, Guerrero Gaván declared that the painting is, quote, composed of elements that are simple but intensely poetic and human. Statements such as this provide meaningful insight into his New Mexico mural, since its conciliatory message of inter-American cooperation hangs in tension with a counter-hegemonic hegemonic commitment more aligned with Pan-Hispanism than U.S.-led Pan-Americanism. Associated with the influential writings of Nicaraguan poet Rubén Darío and Cuban writer José Martí, Pan-Hispanism put forth a bifurcated cultural model that posited Spanish-speaking nations as aesthetically and spiritually superior to the Anglo-American North, where capitalism and technology had depleted and dehumanized modern society. The subversive elements of Guerrero Galvan's mural passed largely unnoticed, situated as it was within the interpretive framework of the good neighbor diplomacy. During the dedication ceremony on February 13, 1943, the artist presented the mural as a gift to the university, which was formally accepted by the Lieutenant Governor of New Mexico and the university president. Zimmerman praised Union of the Americas as a highly dramatic and powerful successor to the decorative art program begun by Adams 6 years earlier, and he pledged on behalf of the campus community a commitment to inter-American cooperation. Reversing more than a century of racial discrimination and asymmetrical power relations was an ambitious and difficult task. Although careful to resist U.S. economic and political expansion, Mexico generally voiced support for Roosevelt's good neighbor policy and strove to implement its international policies to national advantage. As part of their own diplomatic efforts in this vein, Mexican artists advanced nationalist traditions and racial ideologies within the unifying hemispheric narratives of Pan-Americanism. U.S. artists likewise attempted to resolve the obvious disconnect between diplomacy and discrimination in their conceptions of transnational American identity and cultural belonging. Yet, as these examples demonstrate, the good neighbor policy never fully supplanted antiquarian and primitivist understandings of pre-Columbian and modern Mexican civilizations, but rather maintained these earlier discourses in tension with the egalitarian rhetoric and revisionary cultural claims of hemispheric defense. A reactionary policy rooted in the global uncertainties of World War II, there was never one monolithic interpretation of Pan-Americanism, nor even an explicit push-pull of U.S. imperialism and Latin American resistance. Instead, there existed a multitude of hemispheric formulations that variously responded, revised, or rejected one another in an attempt to actualize the idealized promise of the good neighbor policy. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Anna Indych-López. Anna's work investigates Latin American and U.S. modernisms, as well as Latinx contemporary art, focusing on trans-American exchanges, the polemics of realism, and public space. Her book on Judith Baca, which will be published in early 2018 by the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center and the University of Minnesota Press, probes the public artist's aesthetic strategies to activate the contested sociopolitical, spatial, and racial histories of Los Angeles in the 1970s and 1980s. She is the author of Muralism Without Walls, Rivera, Orozco, and Siqueiros in the United States, 1927 to 1940, for which she has received the CAA's Wythe Foundation for American Art Publication Grant, and Diego Rivera murals for the Museum of Modern Art, exhibition of the same name at the Museum of Modern Art. Indych-López is Associate Professor of Art History at the Graduate Center at the City College of New York, of the City University of New York, where she teaches courses on Latin American and Euro-American modernisms, as well as U.S. Latinx art, and is a frequent contributor to exhibition catalogs on modern Mexican and Latin American art. I welcome Anna to the stage.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today and for the beautiful and much-needed exhibition upstairs. It's such a joy to see it. Let's see. I also want to thank Judy Baca and the entire SPARC team. And it's somewhat of a historic moment for Judy, and so I just wanted to acknowledge that. And starting in the spring, she was on the cover of Art News for their underrated issue with a wonderful article by Max Duron, which is on the bottom left here. And the Great Wall, and Judy's the subject of a major exhibition that's included as part of PST right now. It's at the CSUN Art Galleries, and it's curated by Mario Ontiveros, and it's the only PST exhibition in the San Fernando Valley. So I just wanted to acknowledge Mario and Andrea and my fellow contributors to that catalog, which I'm showing you on the upper right. And on the bottom right, I want to acknowledge Chicano Studies Research Center and Chon Noriega and Rebecca Frazier for supporting the forthcoming book on Judy. El Taller Siqueiros, the Mexican muralist home studio and workshop in Cuernavaca, was an international hub in the early 1970s for socially engaged artists, attracting muralists from Mexico, Chile, and the United States. It reopened in 1977 under the direction of Luis Arenal, who continued to promote Siqueiros' practices after the muralist's death in 1974. And so what I'm showing you here on the upper left is what the studio looked like at the time of Siqueiros' death in 1974, when he was recreating America Tropical for Los Angeles, the Los Angeles mural that he never finished, the recreation of it. And then on the bottom right, just a contemporary photograph of what the taller looks like now, and it's also known in a confusing manner, it's known as La Tallera now, but I am going to be referring to it as it was called in 1977, El Taller. It's a long story. There are a few contemporary artists who have engaged as directly with the Mexican muralist aesthetics as Judy Baca. After visiting El Taller Siqueiros in 1977, Baca took up Siqueiros' dynamic realism and his method of polyangular perspective. She applied these modes directly to segments of the Great Wall of Los Angeles, a rewritten history of California that she created over the course of 5 summers in collaboration with other artists and teams of at-risk youth in the San Fernando Valley, 30 miles from Los Angeles. As a result of her direct interaction with Siqueiros' methods, Baca invented the formal and visual vocabularies that enabled her and the team to explore history as a series of tensions rather than as a seamless narrative, and to create an alternative account of California's past, ending for now with representations of the mid-20th century. The idea is that it's a living mural and that she will continue to produce segments. Analyzing the ways in which Baca incorporated and adapted lessons learned from Siqueiros, as well as from Mexican muralism in general, not only provides an understanding of the aesthetic punch and innovations of the Great Wall of Los Angeles, but also reveals the significance of trans-American networks of exchange in the formulation of socially engaged practices and visual modes and narratives. It also illuminates the complex and at times fraught relationship among Chicana, Mexican, and U.S. art histories. In so doing, it allows for the possibility to reconsider public art, social practice, and community muralism as they have been addressed in relation to international contemporary art of the Americas. Baca's reinvention of public art modes and aesthetics through her engagement with Siqueiros and other Mexican muralists encapsulates the artistic practices of the 1970s and onward that by challenging received histories and mainstream modernisms changed the very meaning of art in society. Originally titled The History of California and retitled The Great Wall of Los Angeles by 1980, the project grapples with the practical and conceptual question, among many others, of how a group of mostly untrained artists can visualize an alternative history of California, specifically a history told from a feminist, queer, and people of color perspective on an epic scale. Although the mural's narrative arc reaches back to prehistory, the most reproduced and celebrated images are those that represent the decades of the 1940s and the decades of the 1950s, the later executed sections that bear Baca's distinctive stylistic mark and the modes digested from her experiences at El Taller Siqueiros. Baca and her mural team, low-income and at-risk youth of varied ethnic and racial backgrounds between the ages of 14 and 21, started painting in 1976 at the Tujunga Wash, which is a concrete flood control channel in the San Fernando Valley intended to tame the overflowing Los Angeles River, and it's been used as the backdrop for numerous Hollywood film noirs. They used a method of working that would be immediately abandoned during the next period of on-site painting 2 years later. During that first summer in 1976, Baca divided 1,000 feet of wall space into 10 sections of 100 feet. A different artist designed each of these 100-foot sections with the mural makers. Together, the 10 sections took on a vast sweep of California history, from prehistory all the way to 1910. Each of these sections is inventive, yet bears the imprints of distinct styles, compositional formats, and artists' hands. Dissatisfied with the perceived inconsistencies, Baca later stated that she realized that in those first 1,000 feet, the mural was a loosely connected series of easel paintings rather than a coherent aesthetic product that communicated the collaboratively produced representation of history they had envisioned together. This realization highlighted various concerns for the artist, her practice, and community muralism. How could they maintain stylistic unity and narrative flow while still working collaboratively? The flat and static compositions didn't allow them to make formal and thematic connections between sections. Baca's residency at the Siqueiros workshop in Cuernavaca in 1977, coming between the first and second summers of work on the Great Wall, stimulated the shifts in aesthetics at the project that prompted changes in working method. To begin with, the scale of the Great Wall proved to be problematic. In 1978, for the second summer of work on the wall, Baca altered the working method to facilitate and amplify the educative aspects. When they returned to the wall, Baca reduced the additional length of wall to be painted from 1,000 feet to 350 feet so that the mural makers could concentrate on smaller sections. As a result, the youth had more time in the classroom to engage with the conceptualization of the images. By 1978, Baca had established a partnership with Valley College that allowed the team to go into the classroom once a week to discuss history. Given the paucity of accessible information on Native American or Chicano histories in the 1970s, the mural makers collaborated with oral historians, ethnologists, historians, anthropologists, and hundreds of community members to learn and visualize alternative histories. Collaboration then featured strongly in the conceptualization of imagery, but Baca took aesthetic control of the overall design precisely as a means to ensure the most effective visualizations of the team's collective ideas. In order to animate the static and flat compositions of the early years of the Great Wall, Baca learned and incorporated Siqueiros' approach, what she calls his punto system, and others have termed polyangular perspective. This entails the adaptation of architectonic spaces into new realms of pictorial representation, a realist correction of figures that takes into consideration various angles of observation, not just frontality, as well as the activation of the spectator. And she would have learned this at the Taller Siqueiros. Polyangular perspective, therefore, is a method that enables the active handling of the flat wall surface. One of the clearest examples of Siqueiros' realization of this system is his mural for the third floor corridor of the Palacio de Bellas Artes in Mexico City, which Baca saw firsthand during her trip in 1977. As Mary Coffey has described, the nude democracy depicts a nude woman wearing the Phrygian cap of liberty, who breaks through chains of bondage to vanquish her enemy. Bursting out of the confines of a long, narrow landscape environment, she is violently propelled into the viewer's space through the radical foreshortening of her projecting arms. Oh, I'm sorry. I can see it on the computer. I'm pressing the buttons on the remote. Mhm.
To do. Did it listen to me? No, it didn't. Okay, we were in the right place there.
Is it the computer or the remote?
No. It's what came here. I got disconnected and. Okay, we're going to. We are in one. Let's go with that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Where were we? Okay, so bursting out of the confines of a long, narrow landscape environment, she's violently propelled into the viewer's space through the radical foreshortening of her projecting arms, achieved through experiments with photographic studies. Siqueiros combines forceful imagery, albeit traditional and gendered allegories, with energetic forms and compositions, making the mural a visual manifesto of his theories on dynamic realism. Embracing Siqueiros' theory, Baca began increasingly to divide up representational space at the Great Wall, both in a geometric way and with an eye toward projecting spatial representations in multiple directions. While everything is predetermined mathematically, Baca rejected one-point perspective in favor of multiple perspectives that take into account the movement of the spectator across space and time. Indeed, in documentary footage, Patsy Valdez, a member of OSCO who worked on the wall in 1983, mentions that the mural was quote-unquote technical. More importantly, orthogonals, the invisible force lines of the composition, establish relationships with other parts of the mural. Polyangular perspective, therefore, provided Baca with a compositional means to make formal connections between sections, and strong diagonals served to break up the static surface. This in turn allowed Baca to create different spatial realities, both within a single composition and across hundreds of feet. It also enabled her to challenge illusory depth at strategic narrative moments by having figures forcibly project out through the painted surface and into the viewer's space, rather than recede into the background. In Farewell to Rosie the Riveter, the segment that initiates the 1950s section of the Great Wall, Baca takes on Siqueiros' gendered allegorical figure of liberty in her own feminist adaptation of polyangular perspective. Painted in 1983, the segment features a feminist icon who breaks out of the compositional and historical bounds of the mural. Rosie the Riveter, symbol of the women who left behind their traditional roles as housewives to perform industrial jobs during World War II, resists her return to the domestic sphere, a process made graphic by a television image of a woman with a vacuum cleaner who attempts to suck Rosie back into the simulacra home. It's fantastic. The study for the mural segment indicates the various orthogonals and forest lines of the composition and provides notations to their corresponding resolution in the painted work. It provides a map of the multivalent crossings of hidden diagonals within the composition that create the energetic field and spatial relations of an image keyed toward historical tensions. With the depiction of the wrench, which juts out at an oblique angle against the flow of all other spatial relations within the composition and projects into the viewer's realm, Baca demonstrates her strategic use of foreshortening. Rosie bursts forth from the painted surface and from the television set, which appears to be an alien spacecraft hovering over tracts of suburban row houses. I'm glad everyone finds the humor. Both foreshortening and scale disruption turn her into a larger-than-life figure. In the final version, Rosie's exaggeratedly large hand, another Siqueiros element in a direct echo of the imagery found in the New Democracy, extends beyond the composition to reach out into our space. She breaks the confines of her representation to jump out of the television, suburbia, and the wall itself. Her extended hand also reaches back to the previous segments, reinforcing relationships among the distinct sections. According to Baca, Siqueiros' polyangular perspective allows her to animate the compositions of the Great Wall. But she also uses that dynamism strategically to challenge the legacy of Mexican muralism and to represent forcefully the historical dissension embodied by feminism. Indeed, in another part of my book, I analyze the ways in which Baca's mobile mural, Uprising of the Mujeres, is a fierce denunciation of the gender politics at the taller. The 1920s section of the Great Wall represents an experimental phase when Baca was working out the theory she learned at El Taller, making it a bridge between the first 1,000 feet and the later, more developed sections. The 1920s portion comprises fewer individual segments than any other. It attempts to smooth transitions by blending the edges of segments together to create less harsh divisions and the illusion of a more seamless narrative than the first 1,000 feet. The desired mural effect of aesthetic unification and cohesion learned at El Taller is directly related to an aspect of Siqueiros' polyangular perspective theory, the adaptation of architectonic spaces into new realms of pictorial representation. Siqueiros was particularly interested in breaking up the space of the wall in his quest to take into account the movement of the spectator when viewing a mural. He therefore was careful to transform the spatial experience itself through aesthetics. In doing so, he intended to innovate beyond the normative viewing structures for murals in Mexico and the United States, which he considered conventional. Orozco's mural at the Baker Memorial Library, Dartmouth College, provides a good foil for Siqueiros' theories. Its long, narrow, linear format, as well as its status as an epic history of the Americas, also invites comparison to the Great Wall. At Dartmouth, Orozco approached the wall as he had done in his Mexican murals, in which he painted in colonial buildings, whose very structure of arcades and loggias interrupted linear narratives. Despite the absence of these architectural breaks in the Baker Library, he did not treat the long wall as one open compositional space, but instead divided it up artificially. Orozco's discrete individual panels reflect his sacrifice of thematic unity in favor of abstract correspondences, whereas Siqueiros was more interested in moving beyond flat walls and embracing 3 dimensions as representational space. Thus, for the mural at the Electricians' Union, which represents a culmination of Siqueiros' theories, the team united wall and ceiling and obliterated the corners of the small stairwell through the continuity of images to create a kind of total immersive environment that envelops the entire architectural space of the stairwell. Baca's attempts at aesthetic unification at the Great Wall then need to be understood in relation to Siqueiros' approaches to the wall and to our architectonic and representational spaces. While the 1920s section of the Great Wall is not as dynamic as later ones in terms of composition or use of space, it marks the beginning of a distinctive form of figuration tied directly to Baca. It reflects Siqueiros' volumetric and Baroque forms, combined with the graphic potency of pop art and vernacular idioms, such as graffiti, influences evident, for example, in the dramatic chiaroscuro and hard lines of the faces of Thomas Edison and the Hollywood cowboy actors. Throughout the mural, there is a discordant clash between flatness and depth that brings out spatial and narrative tensions. Yet it is in the 1930s section that the mural begins to take on a signature look in terms of form and composition, specifically in its will toward aesthetic unification and the creation of a Siqueirian representational space. The 1930s portion of the Great Wall, painted during the summer of 1980, is composed of 12 segments that take us from the Great Depression to Japanese internment camps. Here, for the first time at the wall, Baca utilizes iconographic and formal techniques to create the appearance of seamless narratives. There are no literal divisions between segments. Each flows into the next. In particular, Baca uses the motif of the meandering line in various guises, as horizon line, as film strip, as movie screen, as mountainscape, to unite discrete narratives. Yet this dynamic, undulating line that courses in and out of narratives in both diegetic and extra-diegetic ways constructs alternate realities for the viewer. It mitigates the brutalist concrete expanse of the wall to evoke the movements of the river with its high and low points, fitful starts, and abrupt interruptions as expressed through space and time. It can also be likened to a twisting film strip that flickers with images, a fitting structural device for a mural that tackles Los Angeles and California history. This expressive compositional line transforms the space of the wall to make possible and to reinforce visually Baca's and the mural makers' all-encompassing histories of opposition and contestation. The plays with spatial representation embodied at the Great Wall and the will to engage the viewer need to be understood in relation to the wall's unique viewing mechanisms and structure. Viewers see the murals on the below-ground concrete channel by strolling through the street-level park designed by the Army Corps of Engineers with Baca, and they're looking down on the mural from a distance of approximately 70 feet. As the visitor walks the length of the mural, she has a view through a chain-link fence of the mural below and of the bike and pedestrian paths that sit atop the mural on the other side. Such viewing conditions pose a challenge as they necessarily inflict a physical detachment on the viewer's experience of the mural that could potentially mitigate the proximity and engagement that is the social artist's quest. All the muralists face some variation of this challenge. But with the Great Wall, Baca and the mural makers confronted environmental and spatial conditions that make for a distinctive viewing experience. A below-ground concrete channel with a park on either side, sitting in the midst of a suburban community. The walkways that line both sides of the channel weave, stop, and start in the manner of a coursing river, a reminder of the absent river that often makes its presence known by overflowing into the channel. The viewer traversing these paths becomes a physical part of the landscape. Her movements echo the representation on the wall, imbricating her into the disorienting movements of the represented histories. The spatial disjunctures formulated by viewing heights and distances add to the sense of visual and historical tensions depicted on the wall of the channel. Thus, seamless narrative does not translate into unified history, and Baca continues to use and amplify other formal means to convey historical disruptions, scale distortions, and plays on level of representation. The 1940 section, for example, is a clamorous onrush of jarring images that usher us through dissonant war years. The meandering line used in the previous section is still present and can be seen in the floating forms of Japanese-American infantrymen of the 442nd Regiment, the red, white, and blue ribbon that appears throughout, and the landscapes that recede, tilt, and teeter. But it is now accompanied by another recurring formal device, the exaggerated projection of figures from the space of representation through the use of disproportionate scale. Figures such as Hitler, activist Luisa Moreno, and the spirit of Jewish Holocaust victims. And I'm referring to the baby boomer here, this figure here. And a baby boomer compose a maelstrom of diversely scaled forms that burst illusionistically from the wall in the manner of Rosie the Riveter. They punctuate the composition, creating jarring effects related to the distortions of scale, and their projection into the viewer's space is often reinforced through juxtapositions of deep space. Extreme close-ups contrast with distant depths of field, suggesting a cinematic, montage-like approach to space and narrative as a means to visualize contingent and contested histories. Many of the figures that rise above the continuous narrative, because of their enlarged scale and projection from the wall, are screaming figures. Siqueiros commonly use such expressive figures that cry out in anguished protest to elicit strong viewer reactions and sympathies for political causes. His most well-known work with such a theme, Echo of a Scream, depicts a crying baby who sits amid a war-torn industrial wasteland. A disembodied head becomes the echo of the title. Indeed, the brochure for the Taller Siqueiros, intensive course in mural painting that Baca signed up for in 1977, included a representation of a screaming figure. Baca's use of enlarged crying figures relates to such images in terms of both theme and formal manipulation. As James Olds has written in relation to Siqueiros' painting, screaming figures are staples of modernist art that engages with social political trauma, such as Picasso's Guernica and Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin. In each of these canonical works, the fragmentation inherent in cubism or the jarring techniques of montage formally reinforces political strife. The protesting figures of the Great Wall thus link Baca's approach to visualizing historical tensions to this broader modernist trajectory. El Taller allowed Baca to probe Siqueiros' use of polyangular perspective, which enabled her to animate the pictorial spaces of her own murals. Siqueiros' system is evident in the lunging, deep, and clashing perspectives that engage the viewer, enliven the composition, and forcefully bring together varied themes, figures, and iconography into the dynamic spaces of the Great Wall. Baca used strategies learned at El Taller to fashion formal means that bring out the tensions and the ways in which history is constructed, conflictive, and contingent. Overlooked in assessments of the Great Wall have been the many visual strategies, many adapted from Siqueiros, which Baca employed to engage the viewer and to communicate historical ruptures and disjunctures. The combination of polyangular perspective, plays with spatial representation, and manipulations of scale, associated both with vanguard and vernacular styles, such as montage and comics, bolsters the ebb and flow of histories and identities represented in the mural and enacted at the site as contingent and provisional. These methods signal the Great Wall's significance to art history and to the cultural histories of California, the nation, and the Americas more broadly. They make clear the ways in which trans-American networks and dialogues mobilize the innovative aesthetics and narrative visual modes of activist art and social justice public art movements, such as the one pioneered by Judy Baca and the mural makers. Thank you.
Our final speaker today is Giulia Fernandez, a fifth-year PhD student in art history, theory, and criticism at the University of California in San Diego. She focuses on Latinx and Latin American art history and has curated and co-curated exhibitions at the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center, LA Plaza de Cultura y Artes in Los Angeles, California, and UC San Diego's University Art Gallery in La Jolla, California. She was a 2014 Smithsonian Latino Museum Studies Program Fellow, working alongside Taina Caragol at the National Portrait Gallery on the exhibition One Life, Dolores Huerta, which was up in 2015-16, and is currently a current Ford predoctoral fellow. Please welcome Giulia Fernandez.
Thank you, everyone. I also want to thank Carmen Ramos for the invitation and my fellow speakers. It is truly an honor to speak alongside you all. You all are such an inspiration for me. Artists Leopoldo Mendez, Pablo O'Higgins, and Luis Arenal founded the Taller de Gráfica Popular, TGP, as a printing collective in Mexico in 1937. It was meant to connect graphic art with the immediate problems of Mexico, but also international affairs such as the struggles for national liberation in other countries. Like the artists we heard about today, the TGP artists are important players in recontextualizing a global art history, centered around transnational collaborations rather than regional epicenters. The first exhibition in Mexico's Taller de Gráfica Popular in 1938 at the Artists Union of Chicago was a pivotal moment for the group's transnational collaboration with the U.S. artists and activists. From then on, the Taller artists would visit the U.S., exhibit there, and work with U.S. artists in Mexico. This alliance crossed borders and united populist emancipatory objectives. Artists that worked together from both countries were active in anti-fascist and anti-racist movements, as well as sharing an affinity for avant-garde and revolutionary aesthetics. This paper will focus on the presence of artists from the TGP in the US prior to the 1960s, and later the reappearance of the TGP in the United Farm Workers movement, introduced on the cover of their newspaper, El Malcriado, the voice of the farm worker. I will begin by tracing a series of events that uncover the exchanges between Mexican and U.S. artists and activists that flowed between borders beginning in the 1930s. I start by framing the importance of the TGP artists to a global modern and avant-garde art movement, one that moves beyond a limited viewpoint of social realist art or solely its significant political power. The TGP are part of a history of artists that question power structures, rethink audiences, and align themselves to the popular masses through the use of public media, such as newspapers, periodicals, utilizing art. In Mexico, such a history begins with the work of José Guadalupe Posada, whose newspaper contributions and broadsheets included text, images that satirized the government and were accessible to both the literate and illiterate masses. Also, El Hijo del Aguizote, an internationally known newspaper that critiqued the Porfirian regime and was a Mexican counterpart to Parisian periodicals such as Le Charivari and the Caricature. The most influential political moment, however, being the Mexican Revolution, would produce art collectives that were more like labor unions, where artists saw themselves as workers, such as the Syndicate of Technical Workers, Painters, and Sculptors in the 1920s. Within this group, future TGP members joined as part of an early avant-garde movement called the Estudiantistas, led by poet Manuel Maples Arce. The Studentist movement, founded in 1921, included one of the TGP co-founders, Leopoldo Mendez. The movement attacked Mexican cultures such as the leaders of the Mexican independence movement and Catholic saints, while praising European avant-garde movements such as Dadaism and Italian Futurism. Unlike his later TGP style, Mendez's work while part of this group included abstract and cubist-like images, as seen here in The Seamstress, but still critiquing the present moment in Mexico, such as the gender politics as seen with the abstraction of the female figure. The move to a greater relevance to the current political moment increased with the League of Revolutionary Artists and Writers, LEAR, which was the predecessor to the TGP and included most of its founding members. The LEAR was founded in 1933 by David Alfaro Siqueiros, Pablo O'Higgins, Juan de la Cabada, and Luis Arenal, who together produced graphic art, murals, and edited the vanguard journal Frente a Frente. The LEAR members were all part of the Mexican Communist Party and responded to the growing threat of fascism in Mexico and abroad. Their periodical would originally include lino cuts and prints, but in later issues they added photographs and photo montages to their repertoire. In 1937, the LEAR disbanded as a result of differing political ideals, and various members decided to create the TGP in the purpose of better serving the Mexican people, their history, and current events. In doing so, they believed prints would be the ideal medium to reach their goals. Like their predecessors, the TGP wanted their artwork to be accessible to the wide public, and in doing so, they created prints that would be plastered on public buildings and works that would travel and be exhibited internationally. Following the Tayet's exhibition in Chicago, they would go on an exhibit in New York and even in Moscow, finding the critics in Moscow not as receptive as in the U.S. because their works did not idealize Mexican labor and culture. The Moscow critics were expecting social realist art, but the Tayet's work was much more intricate, both in style and in objectives. Although the Tayet preferred representational or figurative works instead of abstraction in order to reach the popular masses, their style was not social realist. Influenced from their avant-garde predecessors, they utilized distortion of scale, inclusion of text as symbolic element, and montage-like images embedded within the print. Furthermore, in their objectives, they still retained an international solidarity with other anti-fascist and anti-racist allies. This was especially pivotal when Elizabeth Catlett joined the group in 1946. Catlett left the U.S. and relocated to Mexico in 1946, where she joined the TGP. She had been living in New York previously, but left in part because she believed that the New York art scene offered no opportunities for a black woman at that time. While in New York, she met some artists from the TGP and found their artwork intriguing due to the immediacy and accessibility of printmaking, which allowed the Tayet artists to address current events. In the series, The Negro Woman, from 1946 to 1947, Catlett showed the history and contemporary life of African Americans in the U.S., particularly the lives and history of black women. She used narrative and scenes of domestic labor, historical figures such as Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and Phyllis Wheatley, as well as the systematic racism faced by black women in the U.S. This series served as an example of the work that Catlett accomplished through the exposure and collaboration with Tayet artists from Mexico. In fact, Catlett credited the fear of political artists during the early Cold War years in the U.S., as well as the turn towards abstract expressionism for her move to Mexico, an eventual collaboration with Mexican artists. Before Catlett's move to the TGP, Tayet artists were exposed firsthand to injustices in the U.S., which influenced their work. A few years after the TGP's first exhibition in the Artists' Union of Chicago, Leopoldo Mendez was granted an award by the Guggenheim Foundation in 1939. While working and traveling throughout the South, Mendez came across various forms of racism and poverty. And in one instance summarized by Deborah Kaplow, Mendez came across about 300 black prisoners working and being watched over by guards on horseback, which he compared to the sights of the foremen watching over hacienda workers during the Porfirian era before the Mexican Revolution, foreshadowing the later comparisons between the Mexican Revolution and the Civil Rights era in the U.S. Mendez's solidarity with the racial injustices in the U.S. produced works such as his portrait of Paul Robeson in 1954, a little cut of the singer and activist done for the series led by Catlett titled Against Discrimination in the U.S. Mendez's linocut of Robeson and Catlett's work would later be reproduced in the Freedom Movement newspaper of African American culture and politics called Freedom Ways. Along with other mass media and graphic outlets in the U.S. beginning in the 1960s, Freedom Ways, like other radical periodicals previously mentioned, and the United Farm Workers newspaper El Malcriado, which will be discussed next, provided both a local and a global platform for theoretical and political thought, while becoming an attractive alternative for artists that produced works for the popular masses. In 1961, Catlett spoke at a meeting of the National Conference of Negro Artists in Howard University, where she encouraged African American artists not to produce work for the art establishment in the U.S., but to a more global audience. Catlett encouraged artists to redirect this focus of the ideal audience from white gallery owners to blacks in the U.S., especially in the South. She suggested that African American artists address the concerns of African Americans in their work, and that they exhibit their work in alternative spaces, such as schools, churches, and community centers. Although Catlett encouraged works to be redirected to a more localized audience, the images were produced during the 1960s and 70s had still global solidarities. The same would be the case for the Chicano activists during this period. In the early 1960s, when the civil rights movement in the U.S. was underway, the United Farm Workers utilized the same methods to build solidarity among farm workers and community members and communicate to a wider audience about their labor movement. The United Farm Workers, or UFW, originally the National Farm Workers Association, NFWA, a predominantly Mexican-American labor union, and the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, AWOC, a mainly Filipino labor union from Delano, California, led by Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and Larry Itliong, among others, drew public attention in 1965 with the Delano grape strike. The Delano grape strike began on September 7, 1965, when 1,500 Filipino workers from AWOC went on strike against the growers in the field. When growers began using Mexican and Mexican-American workers to break the strike, Larry Itliong from AWOC met with Cesar Chavez from the NFWA so they could come together and join the strike. Chavez originally resisted, but on September 16, 1965, the NFWA decided to join the strike. On March 17, 1966, a year later, Chavez, Huerta, and playwright Luis Valdez spelled out the UFW's goals for the Delano grape strike, as well as the identity for the union in El Plan de Delano. The plan states that the farm workers' struggle in the U.S. must be in solidarity with all oppressed people, as they situate themselves as descendants of the Mexican Revolution, imagining their struggle as inheritably tied to Mexico's agrarian past. Before this statement was publicized, however, works by the Mexican printing collective El Taller de Gráfica Popular, made during the 1940s, were reproduced on the front covers of the first volume of the UFW newspaper in 1965 and 1966, visually contextualizing the goals and identity of the farm workers and their supporters. The reproductions included images of unity, dignified labor, solidarity among oppressed people, labor abuse, and labor uprising. Using some of the same strategies of the groups discussed here, the UFW combined image and text while prioritizing the image to communicate to a wide audience. The images reproduced on the covers serve to compare Mexico's pre-revolutionary struggle with the hacienda system to the U.S. labor fight with agribusiness. The TGP reproductions were used during the beginning of the UFW's movement, during the groundbreaking strike in 1965, in order to literally visualize the movement. Important to note at this time, the editors of the newspaper specifically chose not to include photographs or even photo montages, but instead artworks of well-known radical Mexican prints. The TGP's graphic woodcuts and lithographs, originally produced to respond to various international social and political events, were pedagogical works for its present moment and future generations of artists and activists. Doug Adair, UFW member and newspaper editor, recounts that the early issues of the newspaper, quote, drew a link between the farm worker struggle for justice in the U.S. and the peasant struggle for justice in the Mexican Revolution. And furthermore, there were many folks in Delano in 1965 who had personal stories, or personal experience with the revolution and its aftermath, and with the serfdom and pre-revolutionary hacienda system, which they would compare to the system of California agribusiness, end of quote. In fact, in an issue from May 5th, 1966, on the second page, the editors asked readers to submit stories about their ancestors who had fought in the revolution. Further, showing the editor's advanced knowledge of the artist and activist history of the artwork, the second page of the newspaper usually explained the print on the cover, sometimes describing the artist's background, the subject matter of the artwork, or its connection to the farm workers in the U.S. Additionally, the taller images on the newspaper were chosen so that the subject matter would deliberately be relatable to the farm workers, or directly relate to the goals of the union as stated in a Plan Delano, as seen in the following examples. Here, the print titled Huenecan Agave Worker, Cortador de Sisal, made by Alfredo Salce for a series titled Estampas de Yucatán in 1945, was produced in the newspaper in their 6th issue in 1965. The editorial on the second page of the newspaper discusses the values of one's work, stating, quote, work is a sacred thing, just like wages. Each individual is endowed with dignity. The work of this individual deserves a fair salary, end of quote. Salsa's image of a Mayan stoically bending down to cut sisal in a vast field of agave with an hacienda in the distance contextualized the dignified labor within agribusiness described in the newspaper. The subject matter of the indigenous Maya of the Yucatan Peninsula, tied to dignified labor, reappeared in the 19th issue in another print by Salce called Weaver of Becal Baskets, or Becal Hats, in the same series. Like the previous print, this print focuses on a single figure, barefooted, historically working. The second page again describes, quote, Salce has used the Maya Indians of Yucatan, Mexico, as the subject of his expression of the dignity of work, end of quote. This particular depiction of indigenous subject matter represents a romanticized vision of labor as dignified work, as well as an idealization of the indigenous Maya people as humble, barefooted, stoic people. The print provides a positive image for the farm workers, a historical narrative that connects them to a lineage of dignified work represented by indigenous imagery. The next cover also depicts an optimistic image and goes back to the UFW's goal in the Plan Delano, solidarity among all oppressed people. The print titled Mother and Child, originally made by Elizabeth Catlett in 1944, was reproduced in the newspaper in their 18th issue, depicting a black mother and child. Catlett was known for abstracting the image of archetypal figures of African American women in wood and stone sculptures. This particular subject matter of an interlaced mother and child was common among her work, a symbol of unity and protection. The UFW describes the print stating, quote, Catlett communicates through her art the dignity of all oppressed people, using the direct verbiage from the Plan Delano. The image of the mother and child depicts a maternal protective figure through a transnational relationship among all oppressed people. And the next two covers appear later in the first volume of the newspaper, move away from this idealized vision into into injustice and revolution. This one by Jesus Escobedo, titled Las Acordadas, the Remembered, made in 1947 for the series Estampas de la Revolución Mexicana, was reproduced by the UFW on the cover of their 38th issue. Unlike the previous two prints discussed that were made with the lithograph method, which creates softer, finer details, this print was produced using the woodcut method. Woodcuts produce harsh lines and contrasting shapes, creating very expressive works. The method enhances the overall context of harsh labor conditions and abuse of workers by the cruel landowner. The image focuses on two male figures bound by their hands and neck, pulled by the landowner on horseback. The male figure, although we do not see their faces, are of differing ages. The man on the left is larger and older, perhaps the father. The man or boy on the right is smaller and younger, perhaps the son. In the distance, there is a scene of more men being dragged away, dehumanized labor. This cover image exemplifies the UFW's comparison between their own struggle with agribusiness and the fight for land reform during the hacienda system in Mexico. Although the original TGP image was produced after the land reforms of the Mexican Revolution, the TGP reproduction here was meant to mimic the injustices faced by the farm workers in their present moment, in hopes to spur action and increase efforts in support of their strike. In this final reproduction I will discuss today, it goes back to a hopeful image of the popular masses coming together. The cover of this newspaper, published on June 30th, 1966, reproduced the print by Hernando Castro Pacheco titled Carrillo Puerto, Symbol of the Southeastern Revolution, originally made in 1947. This woodcut again produces harsh and dramatic lines, which are representative of the subject matter. There's extreme repetition of the image and shapes to enhance the vision of the masses coming together in unified protest. The raising fists and tools or weapons of the workers echoes the raising of the revolutionary flag of Puerto, who leads the people. The print depicts a revolution led by Carrillo Puerto, a socialist who fought for land reform for the indigenous Maya people of the Yucatan. Pacheco depicts Puerto holding a flag with the words Tierra y Libertad, land and freedom, a phrase originating from Ricardo Flores Magón and popularized by Emiliano Zapata. The flag and Puerto himself become the revolutionary masses. The groups of Maya laborers become one solid mass or force. The repeated figures add to the growing solidarity of the workers. If the previous print showed the injustices of the workers, this print showed the result and reaction of the laborers against the unjust treatment of the workers by the powerful landowners. This image became a call to action for the United Farm Workers. The cover was produced 3 months after the declaration of the Plan del Llano and represents a culmination of creating an identity for the union and its community that is finally leading to action and hopes for actual change within the lives of the farm workers. The TGP images reproduced on the UFW El Malcriado was also a search for their cultural identity within the U.S., one that was not necessarily tied to the U.S. history. As farm workers of predominantly Mexican descent and within a time of heightened Chicano movement demanding civil rights, the UFW saw their injustices in the U.S. tied to a longer history of struggle for labor and land rights. However, the UFW had no claims to the land that they were working on, so it was not land that they were asking for, but simply a union contract to be able to fight for basic human rights, such as a livable wage, adequate rest periods with water and shade, eliminate the spraying of pesticides on farm workers, and other fundamental requests. The farm worker movement was part of a larger transnational movement for the popular masses, and so they utilized a medium that historically led radical movements. By reappearing in a union newspaper, the Taller de Gráfica Popular continues to question power structures, rethink audiences, and align with the masses. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to present my colleague, Josh Franco, who completed his PhD in art history at Binghamton University in 2016. His research focused on the co-production of the town of Marfa, Texas, through the aesthetics of and attendant cultures of so-called minimalism and raspachismo. Franco has presented scholarly and critical work at Marfa Book Co., Stanford University, Dartmouth College, Hemi Graduate Student Initiative, the Frick Collection, the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture, Joan Mitchell Foundation, and Independent Curators International, among others. He served as Latino Collection Specialist at the Archives of American Art prior to his position as National Collector. Before joining the Smithsonian, he was an artist guide at 101 Spring Street, Judd Foundation. As an artist, Franco has produced and exhibited one artwork annually since 2009. Very interesting. I welcome Josh to the stage.
Hi, everybody. So I would like to thank Carmen for inviting me to be part of this momentous event. And momentous seems like the word and not good enough a word. Today's presenters have succeeded spectacularly, and I wrote the word spectacularly before, and they proved it, in analyzing for us the context of transnational art making and world politics in which Tamayo produced the works this important exhibition puts before us. I hope you'll join me in appreciating the specialness of this exhibition and today's symposium. I look forward to celebrating at the opening tonight after just a bit more scholarly inquiry, but we'll detour first with a little personal inquiry, me inquiring myself. I am from West Texas, from a family that was mostly in place there before 1848, before Texas was Texas, before it was the United States. Remains of adobe structures in the town of Terlingua attest to our long history in the region. My great-grandfather, Antonio Franco, stood where you see me standing in this photograph, facing a range of hills on the other side of which is Mexico. Though they have technically never resided in Mexico or been Mexican citizens, all of my grandparents insist, somos mexicanos, we are Mexicans. This was confusing growing up, not least of all because my Spanish isn't so great. The U.S.-Mexico border was not only a line that birds cannot see, it was a line that my family could not or would not see either. That poetic line about a line, an incisive description of the border from which today's symposium takes its title, was penned by Alberto Rios in 1952. In the era of art and political history richly revisited by my amazing colleagues today, this morning and this afternoon. It's now my task to ask some further questions, but first a brief foray into the site where I find myself standing these days, the Archives of American Art. The Archives of American Art is the largest repository in the world for primary source documents related to the history of American art. Today, along with the presenters and in the spirit of Tamayo, I will show you items from the collection that expand the idea of America beyond the United States. Particularly, I will show selections from the papers of Chas Bohorquez and Tomás Ibarra-Frausto that document exchanges between US-based art world figures and Mexico, as fervent as the ones we've heard about at length. I will close by considering the work of Post Commodity, a collective of Native American artists whose monumental 2015 work, Repellent Fence, came to mind, unexpectedly, over and over again as I read through each paper. Chas Bohorquez is an LA-based artist, frequently cited as the man responsible for bringing graffiti and Cholo script invented in the streets of Southern California into a fine art context via painting. His work, Somos la Luz, currently on view upstairs, is a prime example, and I would like to note that the pen sketch of this painting on yellow-lined notebook paper resides across the street in the archives. Bohorquez's papers include many notebooks like this one, with combined writings from travel to Mexico City and notes from classes at Cal State in 1966-67. Bohorquez speaks passionately about his family's frequent trips to his father's fishing retreat in Mexico as a child. As an adult, it was formative for Bohorquez to travel within Mexico, sketching its flora and fauna extensively. Here we see his hand-drawn map, noting, quote, the 5 main states where the Indians settled, close quote, hinting at Chicano concerns with indigenous roots, echoing those of Tamayo, Siqueiros, Rivera, Caló, and others discussed today. For Chicanos in the 1960s, and today, arguably, indigenous groups in Mexico represented a foundation for a national or counter-national identity. However, it was not Mexican national identity they were after. differentiating their projects from those of Rivera Siqueiros and others of the Mexican school, against which, as we have learned, Tamayo laid out his more universal project. Rather, Chicanos researched and deployed Mexico's indigenous groups toward building the nation of Aztlán in the present-day U.S. Southwest. On the page on your right, we see Bojorquez's notes on the city of Teotihuacan and the Nahua cosmology, primarily focused on the figure of Quetzalcoatl. Recuperated for Aztlán, such symbol significance figured centrally in Chicano world-making north of the border. It's almost guaranteed that if one researches in the papers of Chicano and Chicana artists who came of age in the 60s and 70s, Quetzalcoatl and other elements of Aztec or Nahua cosmology will make an appearance as a sketch, a poetized figure, or in didactic accounts like this one. Out of over 6,000 collections in the archives of American art, the Tomás Ibarra Frausto research material on Chicano art is the 5th most requested. Yeah. Tomás. I can always rely on this collection to provide primary source material relevant to the wide scope of Latino art history. In searching for evidence of collaboration between the United States and Mexico, I came across a file containing planning documents for ChicanaCon, Semana de Arte y Cultura Chicana en México, Week of Chicano Art and Culture in Mexico. ChicanaCon was an attempt to programmatically present Chicano culture to the people of Mexico City in 1980. This particular document was written as the organizing committee was, unfortunately, realizing that logistics were not in place and the project began to fall apart. But in this otherwise disappointed letter, the authors capture well the desire many Chicanos have to connect or reconnect with their Mexican counterparts. They write, "We do this as voluntary and disinterested work because we believe that it is important to initiate, promote, encourage projects like ChicanaCon that establish bridges and points of contact between the Mexican and Chicano people. Making Chicano art, literature, achievements, and problems known to us in Mexico is a vital and necessary task, the importance of which will undoubtedly increase as we become aware that Mexicans and Chicanos share the same unavoidable junctures. But fear not. Though ChicanaCon fell apart, Chicanos and Mexicanos did successfully organize an event 6 years later in recognition of those shared unavoidable junctures. Ibarra Frausto's research materials contain the evidence, this program from the 1986 colloquium entitled Chicanos, Pachucos, Cholos, hosted by the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana in Mexico City, UNAM. Some session titles include Productive Restructuring of the United States-Mexico Border, Social Mobility on the Northern Border, and The Punks of Tijuana. Self-Help Graphics, the East Los Angeles-based community center and printmaking workshop, organized an exhibition of Chicano posters and other art in conjunction with the event. So let it be known that archivists do in fact look at contemporary art. We like to know what's coming in 50 years. So please enjoy 3.5 minutes of this video. Repellent fence seems to me a recent apotheosis of the many issues of mid-century modernist forms, nationalist ideologies, and border crossing laid out throughout today. What you see here is a helium-filled 10-foot diameter replica of a scare eye balloon floating above the U.S.-Mexico border. The artists, all Native American, inform us that, quote, scare eye balloons are consumer bird repellent products commonly used in domestic trees and small backyard gardens. These products are effective at deterring unwanted birds for a short period of time, perhaps a few days, and then become entirely ineffective. In this sense, the scare eye balloon is embedded with obsolescence and entirely ineffectual. However, the significance of the scare eye balloon goes much deeper. Its colors, red, yellow, and black, are primary medicine colors, that is, spiritually empowering colors, among many indigenous tribes stretching from North America to South America. Further, it is designed to communicate with birds, the spiritual mediators between the physical world and the spiritual world for indigenous peoples. Therefore, Post-Commodity has appropriated the scare eye balloon as a semiotic vessel that signifies a complex nexus of simultaneously conflicting cultural, economic, and political issues, end quote. And I will presume, I'll be a little presumptuous, that in this audience, that as it did for me, the medicine-colored scare eye also resembles a target, that symbol taken up fervently as a frequent motif by the generation of New York artists just on the heels of Tamayo and his contemporaries, including Barnett Newman, Adolph Gottlieb, and Mark Rothko. In bold, flat primary colors, embedded in an industrial 20th century PVC plastic, and promoted in familiar art contexts, Post-Commodity's following project after this was included in the most recent Whitney Biennial, for example. This work begs to be read into the legacy of modernism we've dwelled in today. The fact that it was created by folks more closely related to the indigenous subjects in Tamayo's paintings and Mexican school murals adds to its productive complexities. Like the birds who don't see the border and who dismiss the signals meant to deter them, like my grandparents who ignore the border altogether, and like Tamayo, who seemed to traverse the line between the U.S. and Mexico at every opportunity and in both directions, I now invite our speakers and you to have a conversation that enacts such a fluidity across nations, across aesthetics, and across the border. Thank you. So chairs will be set up, and our speakers can come to the stage now. Thanks.